Thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my in-depth, hype-free review of the Leica Q3 43, a high-end compact with a 60 megapixel full-frame sensor and a fixed 43mm f2 lens. Launched in September 2024 and costing around $6,900 or £5,900, it's essentially identical to the earlier Q3 from May 2023, but swaps the 28mm 1.7 Summilux lens for a 43mm f2 Apo Monochrome. Why 43mm? Well, it roughly matches the magnification of the human eye. Not the full coverage, of course, but the magnification, and that in turn delivers a natural looking view that's well suited for general use. Plus, it's particularly exciting for Leica fans as it's a brand new optical design and the first time the Q series has departed from the 28mm Summilux since the original Q model in 2015. Now, by coupling that earlier wide-angle lens with a 60 megapixel sensor on the previous Q3, it became practical to make crops for narrower coverage and still have plenty of resolution to play with, but many owners, or potential ones, still desired a lens that was closer to standard length to start with. So while the new Q3 43 lacks the wider coverage of its predecessor, some will actually find it preferable right out of the gate, while cropping in allows it to reach even further. The Leica faithful will of course lap it up, but I wanted to test it like I would any other camera or lens to see how it performs in practice and whether it's really worth spending that high price tag. First things first, there's actually little competition if you're after a new, high-end fixed lens compact camera with a decent viewfinder. The closest model is of course the previous Leica Q3 from 2023, almost identical other than its 28mm 1.7 lens, and currently a little cheaper at around $6,300 or £5,500, but that's still a chunk of change. Sony's fondly remembered RX1R series comes close in concept with a full-frame sensor, viewfinder and fixed Zeiss 35mm f2 lens, but it's not been updated since the 42 megapixel Mark II model back in 2016. Now you might find a used model for around $2,000, but remember the spec is now 8 years old and aspects like the $2.36 million viewfinder are looking pretty dated. Sony, will you just make a new model already? You could of course alternatively build your own full-frame compact camera using a small body and a lens combination at a lower price, and indeed save yourself even more money by going for a used model from MPB, the sponsor of this video. MPB is the largest global platform for used photo and video gear, recirculating over 500,000 cameras, lenses and accessories every year. So whether you're looking for a used bargain or perhaps you want to sell some gear that you don't need anymore, head on over to their website for an instant quote. For example, in the test that I'm going to show you in a moment, you can essentially match the quality of the Q3 43 by using a Sony 60 megapixel body coupled with one of their best G Master lenses. The best deals I found at the time of making this video were on the Sony A7R V, costing from £2,700 in excellent condition at MPB, a saving of £1,000 over new. I also like that they show you photos of the exact model that you're going to be buying and also include a 6-month warranty. You're not going to get that with a private sale. Meanwhile, you could pair them with an FE35 1.4 GM or an FE50mm 1.4 GM for around £1,000 each, also in excellent condition, saving around £500 over a new version. Now I'm quoting pounds because I'm in the UK, but they also operate across Europe and the US. Or if your heart's set on a new Q3 43, you could of course sell any gear that you're not using anymore to MPB to help fund it. Remember their quotes include insurance and free collection from your home, and there's no hidden fees or tricky buyers to deal with. Over the years, I've bought and sold used gear on multiple platforms, but I keep returning to MPB for their simplicity, convenience, and the fact that what they offer is what you get. So why not check them out at mpb.com or using the links in the description. Right, back to the review. Choosing a Sony body and lens over a Q3 43 makes a lot of sense for some people, while also offering more sophisticated autofocus, a bigger grip to hold on to, and of course the flexibility of swapping lenses. Plus, if you get one of those G Master primes, you're going to have a brighter aperture to start with. But Sony's best lenses are typically larger and heavier and aren't available in the 43mm length. And meanwhile, the body user interface is more complex, the build is mass produced, and they use a focal plane shutter versus the leaf shutter in the Leica. Plus, if you were choosing the A7CR on size, you're also going to have an inferior viewfinder to the Q3 43, so there is a lot to weigh up. If you're absolutely looking for a high-end compact with a fixed prime lens and built-in viewfinder that's still on sale, one of the closest rivals is actually Fujifilm's X100 series, with the latest 40 megapixel X100 VI costing around $1,600 or pounds. Now, its APS-C sensor is of course smaller than the Q3's full frame, but the body is thinner and lighter, and while the EVF isn't as detailed, it does offer an optical hybrid option. And some may also prefer the wider 35mm equivalent lens. But again, it's a smaller sensor, it's not weatherproof, nor even filter ready out the box, and it's not coupled with the allure of a Leica lens either. Meanwhile, the even cheaper Ricoh GR3X may have similar coverage, equivalent to 40mm, but it's a 2.8 lens with a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor behind it, and it doesn't have a viewfinder either. So when evaluating the Q3 the unique lens, sensor, viewfinder and build quality are the arguments that you're going to keep coming back to. And while it's undeniably expensive, it is actually cheaper than trying to build a similar system with a Leica M. Plus you're getting autofocus. Ultimately, there's nothing that provides this combination of features, so for me, the question becomes just how good is this lens and sensor pairing? So in this video, I'll be showing you how the Q3 performs in my usual landscape, portrait and macro tests, while also including some comparisons with the Fujifilm X100 VI to see how close that model gets at around 1/4 of the price. Oh, and if you're interested in how a Sony combination measures up, I'd encourage you to watch my G Master lens reviews, which also include similar sample images for you to make direct comparisons. Okay, so let's start with design and build quality, with the Q3 sharing essentially the same body and control layout as the original Q3, albeit now with a grey coloured leatherette finish on the front. Built in Germany, it certainly looks and feels excellent in your hands, and while there's no grip on that flat front surface, the indentation for your thumb on the rear does allow you to hold it pretty securely. Optional grip accessories give you more to hold on to or push up against if you prefer, but I actually found the Q3 was surprisingly comfortable out of the box. The camera measures 130 by 80 by 98mm, with the main body being just 32mm thick. That actually makes that main body similar in width and thickness to the Fujifilm X100 VI, and only 5mm taller, pretty impressive given the larger sensor inside. It's also roughly similar in body size to the Lumix S9. Now the X100 VI is of course thinner than the Q3 when you include the lenses, just 55mm without a cap or accessories versus 98 for the Leica, and that in turn allows you to squeeze it into smaller pockets or bags. But in my time with the Q3 it never felt particularly large nor heavy either at 795 grams including the cap and hood. Sure, the X100 VI is lighter at 533 grams, but both are certainly very portable cameras that you'd be happy to carry everywhere. An important physical difference though is the Q3 is weatherproof right out the box, meeting IP52 standards, whereas the X100 series requires you to mount an optional filter adapter in order to fully protect it, and that in turn thickens the body. Leica also includes a smart looking rectangular lens hood that screws into the outer lens barrel, again an optional accessory for the X100. Leica also supplies a lens cap that's pushed over the end of the hood and held by friction, but this won't stay in place without the hood fitted first. If you do want a cap that works without the hood, you're going to need to buy an optional accessory. There's also an important gotcha regarding the supplied hood. The Q3 lens features an E49mm thread for filters, and it is possible to screw the hood on over them. But when engaging the macro mode for focusing closer than 60cm or 2 feet, the entire lens shifts forward by about 3mm. Now the hood can accommodate this movement unless you have a filter attached, in which case there's not enough room. Now to be fair, Leica does acknowledge this in the manual and explains that you'll need to buy an optional circular hood if you want to use filters with a hood in the macro mode. Or you could simply unscrew the standard hood when shooting in macro, or of course not use a filter at all. But these are workarounds and excuses, and I'm a little bit disappointed that something at this price point should have any gotchas at all. Moving on to power on the camera, twist the collar control and you're good to go just over a second later. The clicky shutter release is threaded for manual cabled accessories. In terms of exposure, the Q3 has the same two main controls as the Q3 before it. So you've got an aperture ring on the lens here running between f2 and f16 in third stop increments, and a shutter dial that runs between 0.002 of a second and 1 second in single stops. Both the aperture ring and the shutter dial also have A positions. Turn both dials to A and the Q3 is in program auto mode. Leave the shutter dial on A and turn the aperture ring and you're in aperture priority, or vice versa for shutter priority. Meanwhile, turn both dials for full manual exposure control. By default, when the shutter dial is set to A, the unlabeled thumb dial in the corner of the camera adjusts the exposure compensation. Or when you have manually selected a shutter speed, the thumb dial can fine-tune it in 1/3 increments. With the shutter dial set to 1 second, the thumb dial keeps you dialing in longer and longer exposures up to 2 minutes, after which you're in T mode, which opens the shutter with one press and closes it with another. At the faster end of the range, 0.02 of a second is the fastest mechanical shutter speed, although as a leaf shutter system, you can synchronize the flash right up to this top speed, and that's a key benefit that leaf shutters have over the much slower flash syncs of focal plane models. And like other leaf shutters, it's also very quiet, with only the faintest click, making it very discreet and perfect for street photography. If you need faster speeds though, the Q3 offers an optional electronic shutter which extends the top speed to 0.16 of a second, in turn allowing you to deploy the maximum f2 aperture in even very bright conditions. But beware, like other 60 megapixel sensors, the readout speed is fairly slow, which means potential skewing for subjects in motion when using the electronic shutter. To illustrate this, here's a shot I took at 1/1600th of a second while panning using the mechanical leaf shutter, and as you'd expect, the beach hertz are vertical. And now here's the version using the same exposure and the same panning speed, but this time using the electronic shutter where the skewing looks terrible. Now to be fair, I have seen a similar effect on other cameras, including the Sony A7R V, so like those models, only use the electronic shutter when both the camera or the subject are pretty still, or you could suffer from skewing artifacts. Moving on, the rear controls are kept nice and simple, with a joypad flanked by menu and play buttons, along with 2 unlabeled function buttons. Push and hold either function button to change their operation, likewise for the buttons inside the joypad and the thumb wheel at the top. If you have spot, field or zone focusing areas enabled, you can use the joypad to move their position on the frame, or alternatively use the touchscreen. It's also possible to reposition the AF area by touch when composing through the viewfinder, like a touchpad, but left-eyed shooters like myself, beware, as your nose will almost certainly end up inadvertently moving it for you. This is why I would have preferred a joystick. That said, while the X100 VI does have a joystick, it doesn't have a joypad, so you can't have everything. The user interface also reflects the clean, simple approach to control. Push the menu button once and you're presented with a quick menu showing exposure details and giving direct access to common settings like the autofocus mode, metering, drive, white balance, quality and film style. You can navigate and confirm using the joypad or the touchscreen, or any combination. Pushing menu again cycles through 6 pages of menus, so the options are kept to the minimum without the sprawl of most modern cameras. In terms of composition, the Q3 shares the same viewfinder and screen as the original Q3, so you're getting a large and detailed electronic viewfinder with 5.76 million dots and 0.76 times magnification in the 3x2 shape. In practice, it looks great, although like many high-res EVFs, the resolution will temporarily drop when using continuous autofocus. Fujifilm's X100 VI has a smaller and less detailed 3.69 million dot viewfinder, so in electronic terms, the Q3 is certainly a step up, although the Fujifilm does have that hybrid optical view if you prefer. For the screen, the Q3 sports a 3-inch panel with 1.8 million dots mounted on a tilting mechanism that can angle up by almost 90 degrees for more comfortable waist level shooting, or down by about 45 to be more viewable when held overhead. Now it's a little odd not to fold up by exactly 90 degrees to be completely square with the body, but it works fine. On the left side, a plastic flap opens to reveal micro HDMI and USB-C ports. There's no analog mic or headphone jacks, but apparently the USB-C port will support some USB-C mics in the future. It's possible to recharge the battery or remote control the camera over USB, or connect an external recorder to the HDMI port. Underneath, you'll find a tripod thread in line with the optical axis, unlike the X100 VI, with the card and battery compartments flanking it. The card slot door pushes forward with a click and springs open to reveal a single SD slot, and it supports UHS 2 speeds. Now most cameras this size also only have a single slot, but at this price it would have been nice to have either tried squeezing in 2 slots, or perhaps including some built-in memory to allow for redundancy. I'd certainly find that more reassuring for unrepeatable events like weddings. Meanwhile, twisting a lever pops out the actual battery itself, which with an additional push can be ejected whole. So the battery itself actually includes the compartment door. It's quite a nice design. As expected, it's the same BPS CL6 as the Q3, quoted for around 350 shots under super conditions, and in my tests, it typically lasted longer than the X100 VI battery. Oh, and if wired USB charging is just too pedestrian for you, the Q3 also supports an optional wireless charging pad accessory, flashy. Atop the body is the flash hot shoe with the model number engraved alongside. As mentioned earlier, you can synchronize flashes up to the top shutter speed of 0.002 of a second versus 0.004 of a second on the X100 VI, but both are still way faster than the focal plane synchronization speeds on, say, those Sony alpha cameras. The lens is arguably the most exciting part of the Q3, not only a brand new optical design from Leica, but the first new lens in the Q series since it was launched in 2015. Like the original 28mm version, there's 3 rings on the barrel. Closest to the front is the aperture ring, running between f2 and f16 in 1/3 increments here, with an A position for automatic control. In the middle is the manual focusing ring, which turns very smoothly, with hard stops at infinity, and just beyond 60 centimeters or 2 feet. Alongside the distance markings is a depth of field scale showing the range of sharpness at f4, 8, 11 or 16, making zone focusing pretty easy. As you manually adjust the focus, the camera briefly magnifies the screen at the last focusing point, along with applying focus peaking for further assistance. Those are the default settings. While supporting the lens with your left hand, your thumb will naturally rest on a tab, which includes a tiny button that lets you lock the camera into autofocus instead. With this button pushed in, just turn the focusing ring a little beyond infinity to engage the autofocus position. Once set to AF, the focusing ring is locked in place until you push that tiny button in again while twisting back to the manual distances. It works fine, but the button is a little bit fiddly until you get used to it. In normal operation, the camera will auto or manually focus down to around 60 centimeters or 2 feet, but by twisting the third ring closest to the camera body, you can force it to enter a macro mode where the range becomes 60 to 27 centimeters. As you turn this ring, the entire optical group is shifted outwards, neatly unveiling a new distance scale. Although as before, you'll still need to engage the AF position at the end if you want the camera to autofocus. And in the case of the Q3, the maximum aperture falls from f2 to f2.8 in the macro mode, although as you'll see in my test later on, it is also closing that diaphragm just a little bit. Now it doesn't matter whether the aperture ring is set between f2 and 2.8, as it'll just be 2.8 until you close it further in this mode. And as noted earlier, the optical group shifting outwards will cause issues when trying to use filters with the supplied rectangular hood. Moving on, behind the lens, the Q3 shares the same 60 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor as the original Q3 with the same quality options. You can record images in 8-bit JPEG or 14-bit DNG RAW, or both if desired, and it's possible to set them independently to lower resolutions of 36 or 18 megapixels if the full 60 is too much. There's no compression options, but you can record in 4 different aspect ratios. Anything other than the native 3:2 is cropped. The substantial resolution provides plenty of latitude for cropping, and Leica leans into this with the digital zoom menu, offering settings for 60, 75, 90, 120 and 150mm, each employing increasingly severe crops. Now the camera doesn't attempt to upscale these images, so as the crops become tighter, the resolution simply reduces. You can also cycle through these options during composition, with a progressively smaller and smaller frame indicating the coverage. Now there's pros and cons to this approach. On the upside, you will effectively see subjects outside the capture area, a bit like using a rangefinder, and that allows you to prepare or recompose. On the downside, as the frame becomes ever smaller, it becomes harder and harder to compose accurately with it, and I just wish there was an option to simply fill the screen or EVF with the active area instead. Maybe there was and I just missed it in the menus. Either way, let's see how those crops look in practice, starting with the original image with 43mm coverage and the full 60 megapixel resolution. Next for the 60mm crop, where the resolution falls to 31 megapixels. Still pretty good. Now at 75mm, where the resolution has become 20 megapixels. Respectable, but not huge. Now at 90mm, where the resolution falls to 14 megapixels. And here's 120mm, where the resolution has fallen to just 8 megapixels. And finally at the tightest 150mm, where the substantial crop has only left you with 5 megapixels. Now when viewing these full images on YouTube or on social posts, that's still enough detail, but you obviously can't zoom into it much further or make large prints. Note that if you are recording DNG files, these will include the full 43mm view, but with cropping instructions that are applied automatically in post. Most applications will, however, let you revert to the broader view if preferred. To be honest, I personally found the 43mm focal length so flexible that I rarely ever felt the desire to enter any of these crop modes, and of course I could just make crops in post later if desired, but your mileage may vary. Now let's have a look at noise across the ISO range, starting with the Q3 at its lowest sensitivity of 50 ISO. I'm going to zoom in by 600% for a closer look to reveal any differences, and I'm also using out-of-camera JPEGs here in order to evaluate the image processing and noise reduction strategies. I also wanted to see how the Fujifilm X100 VI compared, as much academically as anything else, so I'm going to include it on the right hand side at the same magnification. Note that I had to move the Fujifilm camera forward a little bit to compensate for its wider lens and in order to match the subject size on the frame. Obviously the X100 VI's sensor is smaller and the resolution is lower, but it's still going to be interesting to see how their detail compares throughout the range. The lowest extended sensitivity on the X100 VI is 64 ISO, with the second image using its base of 125 ISO. Next for them both at 200 ISO, and now at 400 ISO. Meanwhile at 800 ISO, there's a faint sprinkling of noise on the Leica image, while the Fujifilm's noise reduction is delivering similar detail to its lower ISOs. At 1600 ISO, both cameras are allowing more noise to become visible, beyond which it's a steady decline on both models. It is however interesting to see at which point the noise reduction systems on both cameras ease off to reveal more speckles. Leica's noise pattern becomes gradually worse, whereas Fujifilm's strategy seems to completely change from 12,800 ISO onwards. Meanwhile, at their top sensitivities, neither camera is looking particularly great. Moving on to autofocus modes, you can choose between single or continuous, or let the camera figure out which is going to be best for the subject. But as noted earlier, the viewfinder resolution will temporarily reduce while continuously autofocusing. AF areas include multi-field, where the camera figures out where the subject is, or spot, field and zone, which allow you to drill down onto the subject as desired. Next comes the tracking mode, which allows you to place a frame over a subject that's then tracked while you keep the shutter half pressed. By default, the frame starts in the middle, but you can move it using the joypad or touchscreen, and also choose whether it resets back to the middle afterwards or from the last active position. In practice, it can follow some subjects pretty successfully around the frame, but the autofocus drive itself is still best suited to fairly slow movements. If the subject is human, choose the eye face body detection option. This places squares over both eyes, making you look a little bit like you're wearing glasses, but prioritising the closest one as you'd hope. And finally, you can add animal detection to the mix, but Leica only mentions typical pet types rather than specifics, so beyond cats and dogs, your mileage may vary. Okay, let's see that focusing in practice, starting with the single AFS mode and a spot area in the middle of the frame. Here the camera is positioned so that the bottle falls within the standard non-macro focusing range, and with the aperture wide open you can see the camera refocusing quickly and without fuss. Set it to continuous autofocus though and it performs less confidently, at least in this environment. Couple this with the reduced viewfinder resolution in continuous autofocus mode, and I found myself preferring to use single AFS mode instead, where the camera feels quicker and more confident to me. That said, in general use, the only time I actually came across focusing issues was when the subject fell outside of the standard range, and that was easily resolved with a quick twist into the macro mode, at least not if you're using a filter and a hood at the same time. Here's a quick focus breathing test showing the standard range from infinity to 60 centimeters where the view broadens a little. Moving on, the lens features optical image stabilization to help iron out any wobbles on photos and video, as well as during composition. This can be switched on or off or set to auto, but in my tests it still only seemed to activate during the half press, whether set to on or auto. Here's an example of the slowest shutter speed that I could handhold with OIS enabled at an eighth of a second, although my result at 1/4 of a second wasn't bad either. I'll keep the eighth of a second sample on the left with OIS and show you the same exposure without OIS on the right where it's much more blurred. In fact, on the day I needed a shutter speed of 125th of a second to handhold a sharp result on the Q3 without stabilization, so the OIS was giving me 4 to 5 stops of compensation in practice, so it's a viable feature to make the most of the unforgivably high resolution sensor. Okay, now for my optical quality test, starting with my distant landscape view, angled as always so that details run into the corners. I prefer to test lenses with a real-life distant subject as it's more meaningful for evaluating landscape quality than shooting a chart at close range. What do you think? So here's the Q3 with the aperture wide open at f2, and taking a closer look in the middle at 600% reveals really crisp, well-corrected details out of the gate. Closing the aperture to f2.8 will bring a fractional boost if you're really pixel peeping, but to all intents and purposes the lens is already performing really well in the middle of the frame when wide open. As you close the aperture further, the maximum quality is maintained up to around f5.6, although at f8 you'll notice a very mild drop in contrast and sharpness. At f11 this becomes more apparent, and at the minimum aperture of f16, diffraction has noticeably reduced the overall crispness. So if depth of field isn't an issue, I'd try to shoot between f2.8 and f5.6 for the sharpest results. Let's now return to the f2 sample, see how much sharper this looks, before heading into the far corner where you'll only see a very mild impact on sharpness. As I gradually close the aperture, the corner sharpness improves and peaks at around f5.6, before then softening at smaller apertures due to diffraction. Out of interest, let's return to the middle of the frame at f2 and compare the Q3 on the left with the Fujifilm X100 VI on the right. Both are magnified by the same amount here, but the details are smaller on the Fujifilm due to the wider lens and the same distance. So there's a few variables here, including resolution, sensor size and focal length, but it's clear how the X100 VI lacks the bite and ultimate detail of the Q3, at least when wide open here. Closing the aperture can improve the Fujifilm, but it is still clear how the lens and sensor combination of the Leica is capturing much finer and crisper details, as you'd expect for the specification and price. It's not just about pixel peeping detail though, so I thought it would be interesting to see how each camera rendered the same scene taken moments apart in their high contrast monochrome modes. You're looking at the Leica Q3 on the left in its monochrome high contrast film style, and the Fujifilm X100 VI on the right in its across film simulation with the optional digital red filter effect. This red filter effect has darkened the blue sky on the X100 VI sample on the right, which I personally prefer the look of, but in terms of the style as a whole, I'd say they're actually both looking quite similar on the main building and other aspects. In fact, do you have a preference between them? And for fun, here's the colour versions from each camera, both in their standard profiles, and again these are JPEGs out of camera. Here the difference is more obvious, with the X100 VI's standard Provia simulation delivering higher contrast and greater saturation. Now, I'm personally quite fond of the punchiness of Provia, but I have also always felt that it's a bit heavy-handed for a standard profile, and certainly the default profile of the Leica on the left does look more natural. But as always, these are personal preferences, and both cameras offer plenty of alternative profiles to choose from, including via the Photos app on the Leica. Next for a portrait test, here with the Leica Q3 at f2 again, and using face and eye detection to lock onto me. Zooming in for a closer look again reveals tremendously crisp details, I'd say comparable to the best Sony G Master lenses in my tests. Now 43 f2 may not deliver as shallow a depth of field as say a 51.4 prime, but there's still plenty of background blurb and separation here with a nice fall off between the focused areas and the back of my garden. I'd say the 43 f2 lens works very well for portraits at this close range. For comparison, let's place the Q3 on the left and the Fujifilm X100 VI on the right, both at f2 and with me at the same distance. Under the same lighting conditions, it's interesting how their evaluation of white balance and skin tones differs, with the Leica again looking more natural to me here. The smaller sensor and wider coverage of the X100 VI is also delivering much less background blur as you'd expect. If I edge a little bit closer to the Fujifilm camera to roughly match the subject size, you'll see a little more blurring in the background, but this in turn is becoming a bit too close for a 35 equivalent lens with some distortion now on my face. Like the landscape view earlier, there's also a lot more detail from the Q3, again as you'd expect from the lens and sensor combination. For a more formal look at bokeh and background blur, here's my ornament test, photographed with the Q3 from its closest focusing distance, and starting here with the aperture wide open, which, remember, in macro mode is f2.8. Here the blobs are looking mostly clean with minimal outlining, but you will notice them lacking a curved shape at this maximum aperture. Instead, you can see many of them rendered as 9-sided shapes, reflecting a 9-bladed diaphragm system. Meanwhile, in the far corner, there's some inevitable stretching of the blobs, but again, the impact of those aperture blades. So in macro mode, the reported f2.8 aperture, even when the ring is set to f2, isn't just about an exposure difference. The diaphragm system clearly really has closed a little bit, hence the non-rounded bokeh in this mode even at the maximum setting. Just briefly, for comparison, here's one of my sample images taken at the close end of the standard focusing range at f2, where the bokeh blobs in the background are curved as you'd expect at the maximum aperture. So if you want to avoid 9-sided bokeh blobs, shoot in the normal focusing range instead. Let's now return to my ornament test in the macro mode, where turning the aperture ring between f2 and 2.8 makes no difference at all, as the maximum aperture remains 2.8 regardless. But at f4, you'll now see the blobs begin to shrink and become a little more rounded and consistent across the frame. As the aperture gradually closes further, the blobs keep on shrinking and the geometric shape becomes more obvious. So let's now return to the sample at the maximum aperture of f2.8 on the left and compare it to the Fujifilm X100 VI, also at f2 on the right. Now this was taken from the same distance, so again the wider lens of the Fujifilm means the ornament and the blobs are inevitably smaller, but at the maximum aperture they are at least rounded in shape. Plus the X100 VI has a secret power of being able to focus even closer, so let's now swap the image on the right for the X100 VI at its closest focusing distance, where both the ornament and the blobs have become much larger. I'd say the blobs here are also staying pretty well behaved, nice and clean with no outlining, and again the diaphragm system staying out of the way. So a good result for the Fujifilm here if you can exploit the closer subject distance. To measure the maximum reproduction on the Q343's lens, I photographed my ruler as close as the camera would focus in its macro mode, where it delivered 168mm across the frame. That's not huge in any macro terms, but at least the details are nice and sharp right up to the edges, even at f2.8 here. In comparison, the Fujifilm X100 VI's closer focusing allows it to capture 94mm across the frame, but it's relatively soft at the extremes, at least until closed down to about f5.6. Now before wrapping up, I wanted to briefly mention video, as while most Q343 owners will probably be still shooters, prove me wrong, it also captures respectable looking video up to 8K. There's also a wealth of compression options in the menus, including long GOP, all I, and even internal ProRes, albeit the latter only up to 1080-60p. To compare the resolution and coverage, here's a clip filmed with the Q343 in 1080 at 25p, where there's no crop to the field of view. And now in 1080 at 50p, again with the same coverage. Next for 1080 at 100p, which is recorded at normal speed and with sound, ready for you to slow down in post later. Note the crop though and the reduced quality. Now back to 1080 at 25p to show the broader coverage, before switching to 4K at 25p, which captures more detail, but with a tighter crop than 1080 even at 100p. And next at 4K 50, where the crop remains the same, but you may notice reduced detail. And finally in 8K 25p, where the crop again remains the same as 4K, but with greater potential detail. Notice how I can magnify this by 2 times on a 4K timeline while maintaining 4K's worth of detail. How about a focus pulling test? Here's the Q343 filming in 4K with continuous AF and a single spot area in the middle of the frame. Now it's not the most reactive or confident result, at least with the default settings, and in this respect reminds me a little of Fujifilm's movie autofocus, which also hesitates at times. How about face tracking? Here again there's some hesitation before the AF system reacts to my changes in distance, so it's not going to be suitable for any subject that's in more constant motion. But if you pause for a moment and allow the system to catch up, you can see it'll nail the focus eventually and deliver the attractive rendering that I showed in my portrait tests earlier. And finally, hold on to your lunch as I show you some rolling shutter tests starting here in 1080 25p, where there's minimal skewing. Likewise for 1080 at 50p, which remains pretty well behaved. But now take a look at 4K 25p, where the skewing from rolling shutter becomes very pronounced due to its slower readout. Interestingly, switching to 4K 50p shows much less skewing thanks to faster readout, although this in turn is responsible for potentially reduced detail too. Which at last now brings me to my final verdict, during which I'll share a bunch of sample images, all JPEGs out of camera taken with the Q343. And as always, you can find a selection of these at cameralabs.com if you'd like a closer look. The Leica Q343 becomes by far the best quality fixed lens compact that I've tested, as indeed it should be for the money. The 60 megapixel sensor and 43mm lens delivers some of the best looking images that I've seen from any full frame system, packed with detail and sharp across the frame, even wide open at f2. Meanwhile, the build quality is excellent and the user interface is refreshingly simple. I was also struck by the flexibility of the 43mm focal length. As a long-term X100 shooter, I'd long believed that 35 was the most practical if you only have one lens, but having now spent some time with the 43, it's actually become my preferred choice. It's long enough for more flattering portraits or greater background blur, yet still wide enough that it never felt cramped. I'm surprised how much I enjoyed it over using a 35 or 50. But don't get me wrong, I didn't find anything mystical or magical about the images. They may look great, but judging from my tests, I reckon you could achieve similarly good looking photos given a 60 megapixel Sony A7CR or A7R V coupled with one of their best G Master lenses, such as the 35 or 50mm, for roughly 2/3 the price. Plus, you'll get a brighter lens, more sophisticated autofocus, a bigger grip, and the chance to swap lenses. But the Q3 43 packs this quality into a more compact body with cleaner controls and menus that avoid the complexity of many modern cameras. It's all about the experience, and the fact is I enjoyed shooting with the Q3 43 more than I did with either of those Sonys. Is it worth paying the extra though? Only you can decide. It's entirely personal, of course, but the size and simplicity of a fixed lens compact is why I prefer carrying an X100 VI over, say, an X-T50, even though it's less flexible. And the Q3 43 shares this appeal, but with better quality. Ultimately, there's no other camera with this particular combination of features: a 60 megapixel full frame sensor with a top quality 43mm prime lens and a great viewfinder, all packed into a compact but well built, weatherproof body. It's genuinely unique, but like all high-end or luxury goods, only you can say whether it's worth the asking price. Personally, if I had the money and I felt secure carrying something that valuable in the kind of places that I shoot, I'd go for it. As it stands though, the X100 is more appropriate for my own budget and locations, but I can't lie, my head was seriously turned by the Q3 43. As always, I'd love to hear what you think, especially for such a high-end and expensive product. It doesn't make sense for most of us, but there's no denying the results are among the best of any full-frame system, and it is a pretty compact camera. Thanks for watching, and thanks also to MPB for sponsoring this video. If you've got any used gear to buy, sell or trade, check them out at mpb.com or using the links in the description. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.